Today we're going to talk about the skeletal system. The skeletal system not only involves the bone or the skeleton, but also the joints, the cartilage, and the ligaments that make it up. The skeletal system is divided up into two major parts or divisions. The axial skeleton, which includes the skull, the vertebrae, or the spine, the ribs, and the sternum. And then we have the rest, or the appendages, called the appendicular skeleton, which includes the shoulders, the arms, the hips, and the legs. There are several functions that the skeletal system has. The first one is support, and the second one is protection. These go hand in hand. So support is that it's our internal framework, meaning that it holds you up so you're not a lump of mush on the ground, in essence, right? So it gives you a framework, it gives attachment points for your muscles, and then in the protection role, it surrounds important organs like the skull and internal organs like the heart, the lungs, the diaphragm, the liver. So lots of protection there. And another obvious one is movement. So muscles attach to bones, and they attach to bones through tendons. So when a muscle is connected to a bone, the thing holding them together is a tendon, and we'll talk about tendons more specifically in the muscular system. But when a bone attaches directly to another bone, the piece of tissue that holds them together is called a ligament. And once the muscles attach to the bones act like levers, and so as muscles contract and relax, it pulls the bones and allows for movement. The skeletal system is also very good at storing minerals and fat. Inside the bones, as we get to the structure of a bone, particularly a long bone, there's different areas inside and that contain marrow, and there's a couple different types of marrow. And one of the marrow is very good at storing fat, which is important. And the other thing is that bones are built based on calcium and phosphorus deposits with special cells that we'll get to. And lastly, your skeletal system is very good at making blood. A lot of you don't actually realize that your bones make blood. Blood cells only have a specific lifespan, especially red blood cells, and so you have to constantly replace the ones that are dying off, and it's your bones that mainly do that job. And we'll talk about how that happens in a process called hematopoiesis later on, as we get to the cardiovascular unit, where we specifically talk about blood. But we'll talk about where this actually happens inside the bones. This picture up here is actually a cool picture that we'll talk about when we talk about bone marrow, because you can see there's red bone marrow and there's both yellow bone marrow here, and we'll talk about the importance of each one of those in a few minutes. All right, so the main structure, a lot of people think that bones are dry, brittle, dead things, almost like a dead log, but they're anything but that. Bones are made from living tissue. Now, they include a bunch of non-living proteins and different fibers that are needed, but there are tons of living cells that actually comprise your bone, which is one of the strongest materials that there is in nature. And that's mainly because of calcium and phosphorus mineral salts that are used to build the bone material. When we look at bone material, there's actually two classifications of bone tissue. There's one that's called compact bone, and there's one that's called spongy bone. So let's talk about each one of these. First, let's take a look at the pictures. I think that these are cool pictures, and it's pretty obvious on which one's a spongy and which one's a compact bone. So if you take a bone and you saw it in half, you could definitely see that there is a spongy interior. That would be spongy bone. It literally looks like a sponge. And then on the outside over here, we have very dense, thick, compact bone. So they're both good names to help describe and tell the difference between the two types. Compact and spongy bone do have some anatomical and physiological differences, though. When we look at them through a long bone, and we'll get to the long bone anatomy in just a second. Long bone is exactly that. It's the longer bones in your body. That there are certain areas that contain compact versus spongy bone. Compact bone, like we saw in the picture before, it looks very smooth, very dense, very homogeneous, and it's live tissue, though, still. It's not dead material. So there's live cells in there, and it needs a good supply of blood and nerves and everything that it needs for nutrition of cells. And what happens is, because this bone is so dense, and it looks like there's no pores inside of it, there actually are tiny little channels that go through it. And these tiny little channels are called haversian canals, named after one of the first anatomists who studied bones. So these haversian canals allow capillaries and blood vessels, BVs is my abbreviation for blood vessels, BVs to actually go through and nourish the cells. Spongy bone, because of its spongy nature, it doesn't need these canals because there's plenty of spaces and gaps for the blood vessels and nerves to kind of meander through and supply the cells in those locations with the nutrients that they need. One of the cool things about spongy bone is that their little lattice-like structure, their spongy structure, they're actually called, those little structures are called trabeculae, which you don't need to know, which the word translates to beams. So you have these like lattice-like beams. It actually gives quite a bit of strength to spongy bone. Spongy bone is a lot stronger than compact bone. And we're going to find spongy bone mainly in the ends of long bones, in an area called the epiphyses that I'll talk about in a second, and in the middle of some other bones too, the non-long bones, such as your sternum or your ribs or the bones of your cranium, for example. So let's dive in and look at some bone anatomy. Now, bones come in different sizes and shapes and forms, and they're classified based on their shape. We, in this class, are not going to talk about all the classifications that you see here. We're just going to focus on one, which is a long bone. So if we look at a long bone, there's three major areas of a long bone that I would like you to know. The first part is called the diaphysis. This is the long middle piece of a long bone. So as you can see in this picture over here, this right down over here, this would be the diaphysis. Now the ends that bulge out are called the epiphyses. So right from here to here, that's kind of like the diaphysis. And then the ends from here to here and here to here, those are the ends, or the epiphyses. One is an epiphysis. Both, plural, are epiphyses. And those are the areas that actually contain the spongy bone. There's no spongy bone in the diaphysis. It mainly is just a hollow cavity on the inside called a marrow cavity, and then compact bone surrounding it on the outside. And if you think about that, that would mean that that's why bones typically break on the diaphysis, because it's actually weaker in this middle part, and the strength comes from the spongy bones being on the epiphyses. And then the last thing is there is a thin membranous covering of connective tissue that surrounds bones called the periosteum. And think of like a piece of thin plastic that's wrapped around something, and that's what the periosteum is. The word literally means around a bone. So this fibrous connective tissue just lies on top of the compact bone. And there's live cells within that as well. This is a picture that I put on your paper, and so you could label it. So if we cut the long bone in half, at least part way, you could see on this epiphysis, you could see the spongy bone within it. Now on this epiphysis, you could also see this very dense line of compact bone. This is called the epiphyseal line, sometimes called the growth plate, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then down over here, you just have the compact bone on the outside, whereas the inside is hollow. That's what we call the marrow cavity. And we're going to find a type of bone marrow called yellow bone marrow within that area of the diaphysis. And then there's another epiphysis at the end. If we take, this picture is taking a small chunk and zooming in on it. So if we look closer on the diaphysis in this area, we could see the yellow bone marrow. We could see the periosteum being peeled off, so that very thin connective tissue membrane on the outside. You could see blood vessels are able to get through there, and these little channels or haversian canals where blood vessels and nerves could get through to the cells of the bone. Now if we zoom in on a little part of that, you could see on the spongy bone area, so right here if we zoom in, you could see this blue stuff on the outside is a not periosteum, it's actually a type of cartilage hyaline cartilage or articular cartilage. And the reason it's found on the epiphysis is because that's where joints occur, or articulations. And you need a nice lubricated padding because you don't want bone to rub on bone. That's called arthritis. So you have to have this articular cartilage on the ends of the epiphyses in order for joints to work and move properly. Also in here we could see the spongy bone, and we could see the blood vessels kind of interweaving between there. But down here they have to go through those version canals in the compact bone. And that is all for this slide. When we talk about the bone marrow, there's two major types. Now these are very soft connective tissues. The yellow is found in the marrow cavity down the diaphysis, and the point of yellow bone marrow is that it has special cells that are able to store fat. There's red bone marrow too, and this is going to contain stem cells, and these stem cells are able to perform a process called hematopoiesis, which means making new blood cells to replace the old ones. And so you could see definitely they're good names because the red bone marrow is red and the yellow one is yellow. This is actually cut off the top of the femur, off of the epiphysis of a femur, so you could see both of them. Red marrow is only found in spongy bone. It is not found in compact bone, whereas the yellow is not. It can be found up in spongy bone, but it's mainly found in the marrow cavity. Bones grow and develop in a process called ossification. And as an embryo during development, you start off with no bones. You have all cartilage. And then as cells start to differentiate and specialize, they start to actually create cells that build bone or break down bone. And so there's three major cells that I want to talk about. Osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are the ones that are building new bone material, typically from cartilage. And so they take the cartilage, they lay down calcium and phosphorus minerals and some other proteins, and what happens is it hardens into bone. That's the general way that bones build. Osteoclasts are the opposite of osteoblasts. So osteoclasts are the recyclers. They take current bone, hard bone material, and they break it down to release calcium and phosphorus for other cell functioning, like muscle contractions, for instance. And that's actually a good thing because your bones are where most of your calcium and phosphorus are stored, like 99% of it. So if you need it, that's where you have to go for it. And then there's a third type of cell called an osteocyte. And these are just your mature bone cells that help maintain the constant minerals in the bones, and it allows them to stay strong as they grow. And one of the cool things is that when osteoblasts are building the bone material, they actually build it themselves into the bony matrix, and they surround themselves with new bone material as they build it. So they trap themselves in essence. And when that happens, the osteoblasts actually turn into osteocytes. And so osteoblasts eventually become osteocytes after they build the bone and they trap themselves within that bony matrix, and then they help maintain that mineral composition. When osteoblasts and osteoclasts don't work in opposition equally, and one builds faster than one breaks, or one breaks faster than it builds, then you get some bone disorders that we'll talk about, like osteoporosis, for example. Within the epiphyses of your long bones, you have this thin band of cartilage, and that's called the epiphyseal plate. And this thin layer of hyaline cartilage is maintained there until you're done growing. So this cartilage keeps on making more and more cartilage just in this thin layer during your prime growth years. And what happens is that you have a lot of osteoblasts replacing this cartilage, building new bone material, and then the bone elongates and you get taller. What happens is that at the end of adolescence, towards the end of your growth spurt, hormones will change in the body, and this process will slow, and less cartilage gets replaced, and eventually all the cartilage in that epiphyseal line or epiphyseal plate completely all ossifies, and so there's no cartilage left, and that signifies that you're done growing and you're not going to get any taller. And so that is the epiphyseal plate. It's kind of cool to see them on an x-ray. So you could see that this one is still open, which means that this person would still be growing, whereas this one has closed and left this faint little line right here. So this person is no longer growing. In general, bones grow when you start as an embryo, and then as a fetus, and then as a child, and even through late adolescence into adulthood as you go, depending on what bone it is. So in an embryo, from this picture, you could see that embryos are mainly cartilage, and then the cartilage is used to lay down new bone material. And eventually the bone is elongating, your marrow cavity is forming, the spongy bone that was in the middle is going away and hollowing, the spongy bone is forming on the epiphyses, and you can see the epiphyseal line with the cartilage and the articular cartilage on the end, and that's going to allow the bones to get longer as they grow. But bones could also grow in different ways too. Bones never really stop growing and repairing themselves. So bone remodeling and repair happens throughout your whole life. And it's because you're constantly putting your body under different stresses and pressures and exercise. And it's important that you do this because this is how your osteoblasts and osteoclasts do what they're supposed to. Now what happens is that as you're exercising, so as your muscles are getting bigger, let's say that you're lifting weights and you're doing some bicep curls, so your bicep muscles are getting larger. Well, as they get larger, they pull on the bones with more force, and that stimulates your osteoblast to lay down more bone in that area. So it's actually causing what's known as appositional growth, which is the widening and the strengthening of bones, whereas the elongating of bones is just the growth, but we have appositional growth too, and that's done through exercise or lack of exercise. If you broke a bone and your arm's in a cast, you notice that when you get the cast off, your arm is atrophied and kind of withered away a little bit with the muscles. That's because the stress hasn't been there to maintain bone or muscle tone. When astronauts go into outer space, they're forced to exercise because they greatly lose a lot of bone density because of the lack of gravitational stress on their body. And so this is that appositional growth I was talking about. So the bone could grow long ways, like here, that's through the epiphyseal plate and that cartilage to get longer. But if there's a muscle attached to this one area and it keeps on pulling on this one area, the osteoblasts in that area will start to build bone out this way to make the bone stronger and wider. Joints are also part of the skeletal system. They're a very important part of the skeletal system because it's where two bones come together and they articulate, so they're called articulations. And that just means that there could potentially be types of movement that occur. Now, joints are pretty complex. We're just going to talk about the major types and different examples of those types, but some of them go into actually more detail than we will for this class. But in general, you have a lot of connective tissue that holds the bones together in that articulation. This is where ligaments come into play. So a ligament holds bone to bone, and you're going to find most ligaments are located where joints are. There's three main types: immovable, slightly movable, and freely movable. An immovable joint is sometimes known as a fibrosis or synarthrosis, and this is where there's no movement. So you're going to have two bones that grow together, and when they grow together, they fuse, and that's that, no movement. The skull bones of the cranium, where they fuse together after childhood, that is called a suture, that squiggly line that you could see in the top picture of the skull. And those sutures allow for no movement at all. During development as a fetus, they're not fused yet. There's actually a lot of cartilage that's between them. And during birth, that cartilage allows those plates to actually slide over each other to compress the skull and make it smaller to make it out of the birth canal. And then afterwards, they kind of move back to their normal position, and then by usually 2 years old, they have completely fused, and there's no more soft spots in a baby's skull. And those soft spots are called fontanelles. And the main one is right at the top of the baby's head, and you can see it in the picture in the bottom right. So those will close up by the age of 2, typically. Another immovable joint would be at the distal end of the tibia and fibula, which is by your ankle. And those two bones, they don't actually fuse together, but there's a ligament that holds them together that doesn't allow for movement. But you may notice that you hurt that ligament or tore the ligament if you sprain your ankle. The next one are slightly movable joints. These are also known as cartilaginous or amphiarthroses. They only allow just a little bit of movement because the bones are still separated, and there's usually a piece of cartilage that helps separate those bones, such as in the vertebrae with the discs that separate the vertebrae. And if you look at the hip bone in the front, the pubic bones where they come together, called the pubic symphysis, there's a piece of cartilage there, and it allows just a little bit of movement, a little bit more in women due to childbirth. Then we have the largest group of joints called the freely movable joints, which are sometimes called synovial joints or diarthroses, which means that you're going to have movement in two or more directions, and most of these joints are going to have kind of a complex joint system with things like membranes, synovial fluids, ligaments, bursa, which are fluid-filled sacs, to make sure the joint is cushioned and lubricated and working how it should. And so these are the ones that usually get injured the most because of the most range of movement. And there's 4 types that I'm going to talk about, but there's actually a few more on top of this as well. The first one are ball and socket joints, and this is going to allow multi-directional movement. So these are freely movable joints. Your shoulder and your hip, they allow full rotation. Those are the 2 main ones in your body. Pivot joints rotate one bone around the other. So if you flip your arm over or rotate your arm, supinate and pronate, which are terms that deal with rotating, then the ulna and the radius will kind of flip over each other. And then if you think of the neck, the vertebrae in your neck are called cervical vertebrae, and your top 2 are called the atlas and the axis. And the picture shows how they're rotating on each other, and that's why you could shake your head no, because they're pivoting. It's a pivot joint. Hinge joints are like doors on a hinge, so they just go back and forth. So your elbows going back and forth and your knees bending back and forth are classic hinge joints. Then we have the saddle joint, which is in your thumb, and it's when one bone kind of slides in 2 directions. It's not quite like a ball and socket movement because of the bone shaped like a saddle, but it allows a sliding motion in that 2 directions, and that's why you have an opposable thumb. That's what makes it opposable, your saddle joint. You could touch every finger with your thumb. There's a few other freely movable joints too, and those are mainly in your hands and your feet with your wrist bones, your carpals, and your metacarpals and phalanges, and then your tarsals, your metatarsals, and your phalanges of your feet, and they're called gliding or planar and also condylar ones, but we will not be responsible for knowing those in this class. And that is it with the skeletal system. I hope that was helpful. I'll see you in the next video.